I bought the tiniest horse at the auction rescue horse transformation. The auction hall was buzzing with the sound of eager bidders, each one eyeing the horses being paraded in front of them, hoping to find the perfect addition to their stables. The air was thick with anticipation, but there was one horse that everyone seemed to ignore. A small, fragile creature stood at the far end of the line, barely noticeable amidst the larger, stronger horses. She was the tiniest thing you could imagine, a miniature horse who seemed so out of place in the busy auction. Her coat was matted and dirty, the once bright color now dull and patchy. Her ribs were visible, a clear sign of malnutrition, and her large eyes shone with fear, darting around the room in search of something familiar, something to hold on to. Her tiny hooves barely made a sound as they clicked on the cold floor, a stark contrast to the powerful strides of the other horses being showcased. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the hall, calling out bids for the bigger, stronger animals that everyone wanted. But when the tiny horse stepped forward, there was an awkward silence. No one seemed interested. The murmurs around the room were filled with disinterest and a little mockery. Some bidders shook their heads. Others turned their attention to the horses with more potential. After all, who would want a horse so small and sickly? I couldn't help but stare at her. Something about the way she stood there, almost as if she didn't belong in this place, tugged at my heart. She wasn't like the others, and maybe that was what made her so special. She wasn't just a horse. She was a creature in need, a soul that deserved a chance, even if the world around her had forgotten that. As I watched the auctioneer move on to the next horse, I felt my heart race. This was my chance. But there was no way I could let her go unnoticed, not if I could help it. The tiny horse needed someone who believed in her, someone who saw beyond her appearance, beyond her frailty. I knew I had to be that person. With a deep breath, I raised my hand. 500. I called out, the words almost a whisper in the vast hall. But they were enough to grab the attention of the auctioneer. His eyes met mine, and a small smile curled at the corner of his lips. He had probably never expected a bid for such a small, weak animal. The bids for the bigger horses kept climbing, but for the tiny horse, there was only silence. The auctioneer looked back at me, almost surprised, as if waiting for someone else to jump in. But no one did, and just like that, it was done. I had bought the tiny horse. She was mine. But as I looked at her fragile form, still trembling from the loud noises and unfamiliar faces, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right decision. Could I help her? Could I give her the life she deserved? The road ahead would be long, but I had already made up my mind. This was only the beginning of her journey, and mine. When I first laid eyes on her outside the auction hall, the weight of what I had just done hit me like a ton of bricks. The tiny horse, who had been so easily overlooked by everyone else, was now mine. But the journey ahead didn't feel as certain as I had imagined it. She was fragile, and I could see that the world had already been hard on her. As I drove the truck slowly toward my property, the tiny horse shifted nervously in the back. She wasn't used to being in a vehicle, and her wide, anxious eyes constantly darted around, trying to make sense of her new surroundings. The rhythmic clop of her hooves on the hard surface of the trailer was the only sound filling the quiet ride. Arriving at the stable felt like a dream. I had prepared everything, but now that she was here, I found myself unsure of where to begin. The gates to the stable creaked open, and I slowly stepped out of the truck, heart racing. The tiny horse, still shaking from the ride, stood frozen in the trailer, her big eyes reflecting confusion and fear. Her coat was dirty, matted with a layer of dust that clung to her like a veil, hiding the small but delicate frame beneath. Her legs were weak, and I could see the remnants of her past in the form of old scars and bruises. I took a tentative step forward, speaking softly, trying to calm her. "It's okay, girl. You're safe now." But she wasn't ready to trust me yet. Her head jerked back slightly, and she took a step away from me. I could feel the hesitation, the fear in her every movement. It was like she had been let down so many times before that she didn't know what kindness was anymore. I reached for the halter I had brought with me, and she stiffened, watching my every move. I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. I knew she wasn't used to human touch, and the last thing I wanted to do was push her too hard. Instead, I knelt down in front of her, keeping my voice calm and steady. "It's okay, girl. You don't need to be scared anymore. I'm here to help." There was a long moment of silence before she took a hesitant step forward, her small hooves scraping gently against the trailer's floor. I could tell she was still unsure, but she was curious. She inched closer, and I gently extended my hand toward her, not moving too fast, not forcing her into anything. Slowly, she sniffed my hand, her warm breath mingling with mine. The moment felt like a breakthrough, a tiny step in the right direction. I smiled, barely believing it. The horse that had once been surrounded by fear and uncertainty had just taken a leap of faith in me. There was still a long way to go, but in that brief encounter, I felt something shift between us. I softly slipped the halter over her head, and she stood still for a moment, as if realizing the gentle touch wasn't a threat. I led her into the stable, watching her every movement, making sure to give her the space she needed. Her tiny form seemed so fragile in the vast space of the barn, but something told me she wasn't giving up just yet. Her journey was just beginning, and so was mine. The first few days with the tiny horse were filled with uncertainty. As I led her into the stable, she hesitated, her body trembling with every unfamiliar sound. The barn was quiet, but even the soft rustling of the hay seemed to startle her. She stood in the corner, eyes wide, as if she were waiting for the world to change in a way she couldn't understand. I stood quietly, watching her, trying not to overwhelm her. There was so much I needed to do, but I knew the most important thing was to earn her trust. The physical care would come later, but for now I needed to make sure she felt safe, loved, and cared for. The first thing I did was offer her food. I filled a bucket with fresh hay and a mix of oats. At first, she didn't seem interested, her head down as she sniffed the ground. She was thin, too thin, and I could see the ribs poking through her dull coat. Her eyes were dull too, almost lifeless. She had been through so much, it seemed impossible to believe she could find joy in something as simple as food. But I wasn't about to give up. I sat on the floor of the stable, not pushing her to eat, just letting her see I was there, that I wasn't going anywhere. It felt like hours watching her inch closer to the bucket. She finally dipped her head down, hesitantly taking a bite. The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. She had begun to trust me enough to eat in front of me. I continued my routine with her over the next few days, feeding her, grooming her, and talking to her in a soft voice. Each day, she grew a little bolder, her steps less hesitant, but I could still see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't gone, not yet. She flinched when I moved too quickly, and sometimes she would pull away from my touch. She had learned to protect herself, to keep her distance, and I understood, but I wasn't going to push her. Every day I gave her space to come to me when she was ready. There were moments of progress, though, and they were beautiful to witness. One morning, I found her nuzzling the hay, her tiny nose twitching as she chewed, not even noticing I was there. It was a small thing, but it felt like a victory. She was starting to relax. Slowly, we developed a routine. Every morning, I would bring fresh food, water, and clean bedding. And every evening, I would sit by her side, just being there. Sometimes, she would come closer, allowing me to gently stroke her neck. She didn't flinch, and I couldn't help but smile. One day, as I brushed the dirt from her coat, I noticed how soft her fur felt under my hands. Beneath the layers of dust and neglect, there was a delicate, beautiful animal. It was like peeling back the layers of her past, revealing the creature she was meant to be. It wasn't just the physical changes that mattered, it was the emotional healing. She was no longer just the tiny, scared horse I had seen at the auction. She was a soul slowly learning to trust again, slowly learning that not all humans were there to hurt her. And with every small step, I knew we were both healing. As the days turned into weeks, the tiny horse began to change in ways I hadn't even imagined. Her physical transformation was slow but steady, like a flower pushing through the soil after a long, cold winter. Each small step she took, from gaining a little weight to showing more energy, was a reminder of how far she had come. and how far we still had to go. But it felt like we were both on the same journey, each of us learning from the other. At first, she had been so timid, so fragile. She spent most of her time huddled in the corner of the stable, her body tense and her eyes wide with uncertainty. But now, she was beginning to move around more, her little hooves tapping softly against the floor as she explored her new space. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One of the biggest changes was her appetite. In the beginning, she had barely touched her food, but now, she devoured it eagerly. The hay and oats I'd given her were no longer just a way to survive. They were something she seemed to enjoy. I'd catch her grazing in the field, her small form surrounded by green grass, her coat gleaming in the sunlight. She was gaining weight, and the once bony ribs were slowly becoming less pronounced. The transformation was visible, but the real change was happening beneath the surface. Each morning, I would bring her a bucket of fresh food and water, and she would greet me with more interest than before. She wasn't as scared of me anymore. There was a curious glint in her eyes, a small flicker of trust that I hadn't seen in her before. It felt like she was starting to understand that I wasn't going to hurt her. I wasn't going to abandon her. I was there to help, and she was slowly letting me in. Then, one morning, as I entered the stable with her food, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The tiny horse was standing tall in the center of the stall, her ears perked up, her head held high. She was no longer the broken, scared animal I had first rescued. She was showing signs of confidence, of strength. And for the first time, I realized just how strong she truly was. Not just physically, but emotionally. It wasn't just the weight she had gained or the glossy shine to her coat. It was her spirit, the way she moved now. She no longer walked with a limp or the slow, hesitant steps of an animal in pain. She trotted proudly, her head high, her hooves clicking with a new sense of purpose. There was a spark in her eyes, a joy I hadn't seen before. The change wasn't just physical. It was her spirit coming back to life. I started introducing her to some basic training. At first, she didn't understand, but she was eager to learn. We started with simple commands. Step forward, turn, and come here. It wasn't long before she was following me around the stable, responding to my voice, a little more each day. Her tiny legs, once weak and fragile, had become stronger and more graceful. She was like a different horse, a horse that had been given the chance to live. The transformation wasn't just about fixing her body. It was about helping her rediscover her sense of joy. And in the process, I was rediscovering mine. As the days passed, something extraordinary began to unfold between the tiny horse and me. What started as a quiet, tentative connection had blossomed into something deep, something unspoken but undeniably real. She had gone from being a fearful, broken creature to becoming a trusted companion. And it was in the moments of our shared silence, in the soft exchanges between us, that I began to realize just how much she had changed, and how much I had changed, too. It happened one evening, just after the sun had set. The stable was quiet, the only sounds being the gentle rustling of hay and the soft clop of hooves. I walked in to check on her, as I had done every day, but this time, something was different. She was waiting for me, standing at the door of her stall, her eyes alert and focused, as if she knew I was coming. Her ears twitched as she saw me approach, and I could see the smallest hint of a nicker escape her lips. It wasn't much, but it was the first time I had seen that kind of acknowledgement from her. I stopped in my tracks, my heart swelling with emotion. The horse that had been so fearful, so distant, had taken the first step in trusting me completely. It wasn't just that she was no longer afraid. It was the way she sought me out. I wasn't just the person who fed her. I wasn't just someone who cared for her. I had become something more, someone she felt safe with, someone she wanted to be near. And in that moment, I felt a deep, unspoken connection between us. I walked slowly to her, letting her come to me, knowing that this bond was something that couldn't be rushed. As I reached out to gently stroke her neck, she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into the touch, her body relaxing under my hand. Her coat was soft now, free from the grime and neglect it had once carried. She had transformed not just physically, but emotionally. Her trust in me was no longer tentative, it was solid, a foundation we had both built together. Over the next few weeks, this bond only grew stronger. The tiny horse began to follow me around the stable, eagerly anticipating my arrival each morning and evening. She would stand by the door, waiting patiently for me to open it, her eyes bright with excitement. It wasn't just about the food anymore. She was learning to enjoy my presence, to feel safe and loved in a way she never had before. One afternoon, I decided to take her out into the pasture, just to let her run free for a while. As we walked across the field, she moved confidently beside me, her little legs carrying her gracefully over the grass. There was no hesitation, no fear. She trotted ahead, then glanced back at me, as if asking, "Are you coming?" And I was right there with her, every step of the way. When I called her name, she turned and trotted back to me, nuzzling my hand as if to say, "I trust you." It was more than just a gesture. It was a promise. We had both come so far together, and the bond we shared was unbreakable. I had been the one to rescue her, but in truth, she had rescued me too. She had taught me patience, trust, and the healing power of love. Our journey together wasn't just about saving a horse. It was about finding each other. And that, in itself, was a miracle. As I watched the tiny horse stand proudly in the field, the wind ruffling her coat, I couldn't help but marvel at how far she had come. The once fragile, fearful creature that had been left behind at the auction was now a completely different horse. Stronger, healthier, and more confident. She had transformed in ways I never imagined, not just physically, but emotionally as well. And as I stood there, watching her move with grace and freedom, I realized that this wasn't just her new beginning. It was mine, too. The bond we had formed wasn't just a rescue story. It was a partnership, a journey we had taken together. It was in the quiet moments, the ones when she would nuzzle my hand or follow me without hesitation, that I truly understood how powerful our connection had become. She trusted me in ways that words could never express. And I trusted her, too. Trust had been something we both had to learn. She, learning to trust after being hurt so many times, and I, learning to trust in the healing power of love and patience. It wasn't an easy journey. There had been moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if I was enough to help her heal. But looking at her now, standing tall and confident in the pasture, I knew that every effort, every day of care had been worth it. The transformation was more than just a physical one. It was a revival of her spirit, a reclaiming of her joy and purpose. I remembered the first time I had seen her in that auction hall, her tiny body shaking, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. Back then, I had no idea what the future held, no idea how we would get through the difficult days ahead. But we did, together. And now, she was a living testament to the resilience of animals and the power of second chances. Her story was one of survival, yes, but more than that, it was a story of healing. It was a story of finding hope when all seemed lost. It was a reminder that no matter how broken or neglected an animal or a person might seem, there is always the potential for transformation, for a new beginning. And sometimes all it takes is one person to believe in them. As I watched her trot across the field, I knew that this was just the beginning for both of us. There was so much more ahead. Together, we would explore new paths, face new challenges, and continue to grow. She wasn't just a rescue. She was my companion, my friend, and my teacher. And as she looked back at me with those trusting eyes, I knew that our journey wasn't over. It was just starting. I walked toward her, and as she turned to meet me, I couldn't help but smile. A new chapter was unfolding, and I was ready to embrace it with her by my side. Whatever the future held, I knew we would face it together, because together we had already conquered the impossible. If you were moved by this incredible transformation story, don't forget to hit that like button. Your support helps us bring more heartwarming stories like this to life. And if you want to follow the journey of rescue and recovery, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for being part of our community. Let's continue spreading hope and inspiration, one story at a time.